Hello, listeners of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. We are so glad that you joined us today for our next episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. Again, this podcast is produced in collaboration with New Era superintendents who are doing whatever it takes to improve student outcomes for students in reading and math across the country. Our guest today is Dr. Tom Fisher. Dr. Fisher is a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He has extensive experience as a classroom teacher, but then also in higher education. And I think that you are going to enjoy what Dr. Fisher has to say. He is an expert in educational technology, but also teacher preparation. And he works and lives at the intersection of helping use technology in an efficient way to help evaluate teachers and to also provide feedback, but then also to help prepare our next generation of teachers that are going into the field. And as you listen, I think one thing that's important to point out is that Dr. Fisher has done a fantastic job of understanding how technology can be used to really make the job easier for providing feedback to teachers as professionals. He also understands the rubric, the criteria, all of the qualifications that are necessary for helping prepare teachers. And so I look forward to this episode. Dr. Fisher is a friend, but also a professional colleague that has a wealth of information, and I hope that you enjoy what he has to say today. Listeners, this is Eric Tornfeld, the host of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. This podcast is produced in collaboration with New Era Superintendents. Our podcast focuses on exploring innovative ideas that promote the thriving of schools nationwide. Our guest today is Dr. Tom Fisher. Dr. Fisher has held several roles, including teacher, instructional coach, central office personnel, but he also is an associate professor at the Cato College of Education at UNC Charlotte, and works with teachers in their teacher education program to prepare them to work in the field of education, but then also to be successful in the field of education in their teaching roles. Dr. Fisher, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it to have you on the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. What are the things about you that I may not have mentioned in your introduction? I know you've worn many different hats over the years as an educator and as a college professor, but what are some things that you'd like the listeners to know about you?
Well, I want them to know that you're setting the bar very high for the first podcast, having me on here. I don't know where you're going to go after this in terms of the guests that you'll have to do. It almost be like I'd have to co-host with you every week. So you can see I'm full of humility as we get started today. No, I think a couple things that I would just totally get out of the way, because I know that some of our questions really aren't going to focus on that. Some areas that I'm very well known for would be in the field of EdTPA preparation for student teachers. So that is something I'm well known for. I don't think we're really getting into that today. So people know me from that, nationally, presenting and providing resources for those things. And then also I can be seen a lot with GoReact. So GoReact uses me a lot, video platform service, and I'm an innovator with using video platform technology in my teaching and in my supervising. And that's also something that people probably know about me if they know who I am, or if they just Google me or go to LinkedIn or something like that. So those are areas that I really like to branch out into, but that's definitely not necessarily, I'm not a two-trick pony, as it were, not a one-trick pony, but not even just a two-trick pony. But those are things that I'm known for. And then, of course, we've known each other for a good long bit as well.
For our listeners, Dr. Fisher and I go back to 2007 when we were social studies teachers together. So we do have a lot of personal professional history. I like to tell other teachers that I taught Dr. Fisher everything he needs to know, but probably more the opposite. Dr. Fisher, tell us a little bit about EdTPA and GoReact, because even within the field of education, there's a lot of different acronyms for one, but then there's also the different technologies, and there's different things that not everybody who's even in education knows what those things are, but they're actually really important, and they're important. But then GoReact especially is a very helpful tool. So tell us what those two things are.
Sure. Well, I think EdTPA is pretty well known, but it's a teacher performance assessment. And a lot of states use it for licensure, North Carolina being one. And a lot of programs, a lot of teacher prep programs use it as a way to evaluate candidates because it is anonymously graded, externally graded by Pearson. So it's not the instructors who know the students best. It's anonymously, externally graded, and therefore it takes a lot of the bias out of the grading. There's a lot of training to make sure that there isn't bias used in grading it, but it's a performance assessment that requires lesson plans, it requires teaching videos, and it requires student work samples with feedback from the teacher, much like national boards, something that you did several years ago. It's very, very similar to that. I always like to say that it's more about the recognition of best practice, EdTPA, whereas national boards is really about the mastery, right? You become a master teacher when you do your national boards, so you have to really perform well on that. Whereas on EdTPA, performing well is not necessarily, hey, all the students do really well. In your video, you're like standing on your head teaching and everybody's, well engaged. It's really about knowing and reflecting on things that you could have done better, or best practices that you should have used, or knowing things about your students and their specific needs. So it's a little bit different than national boards in that sense. But again, we use it in the Cato College of Education as a endpoint in student teaching. So it's their final sort of summative assessment, but it's also used by the state of North Carolina as a licensure requirement for beginning teachers, whether they are traditional student teachers or what we call resident student teachers in North Carolina, which are sometimes called lateral entry, or people from outside the industry who come in and take jobs because of downsizing or something like that in the industry that they came from before. So that's a little bit about what EdTPA is looking at. I mean, you and I, as we were coming up through the beginning teacher ranks, we did praxis. We did the praxis for our content, whereas we didn't really do a whole lot with pedagogy. Whereas EdTPA really, again, it's a performance assessment. It wants to see the pedagogy. It's not just sitting there taking a content-based test like we did for social studies. So it's a little bit about EdTPA. I know you got your feet wet a little bit with it this past year, working with some of our candidates as well. You also got your feet wet a little bit with GoReact, which is a video capture platform that allows you could give real-time feedback, or you could give recorded feedback to student videos. So a student captures video of their teaching, and we use a set of markers and comments. You can create your own rubric that you can build in, and you can actually do a split screen where you see the video on one side, and then on the other side of the screen, you can see the comments, the feedback, the markers, the reflection from the candidates. There's all sorts of ways to use it. I've innovated with it in my class in terms of having students do rehearsals for me so that they can practice before they get in front of real students so that they're doing no harm. I've used it with administrators at schools where I give them access so that we can give separate feedback and then come together and see what they're seeing with the teacher versus what I'm seeing and what they would like to see. You know what I mean? So that I can sort of find some alignment with what different schools and different districts are looking for in terms of candidate preparation. Because ultimately that's who I'm trying to help. I'm trying to help those administrators as well, because I want them to be able to retain their teachers. You know what I mean? So I want to know ultimately, hey, what do you want them to improve on? How can I help? Right? So it doesn't have to be like, hey, I go in with a mindset of what sort of feedback and my agenda for a candidate. Let me find out what that school administrator, much like yourself, you observe your own teachers on, a daily basis. You go into classrooms for 10-minute walkthrough or even 90-minute, 60-minute periods. And I want to know what you want to know about your candidate, right? So better alignment so that the different stakeholders are really on the same page.
So when you think about teacher preparation right now in this time period where you've got folks that are coming outside of the field of education into the field of education, and in some cases we're trying to convince people to come be a teacher,
Yeah.
And that's challenging too. What would you love to see more of, or where is things like EdTPA or GoReact or any of the tools that you're working with, or what you're just doing and contributing to preparing students to be teachers? What are some things that aren't happening that you would love to see happen?
Well, I think the number one thing, and I use, it is definitely like the number one sort of a recent data point in my career in the educational landscape, in student preparation, in individual student, cognitive, balance, is the pandemic, right? We go back to that we're never gonna forget where we were when that happened. And then what were the takeaways from that? And one of the big takeaways that I saw from the pandemic, that's when I started using GoReact, for instance, right? This new technology platform. And what I noticed was people that survived teaching in the pandemic, for no matter how long it lasted, they took advantage of technology. They took advantage of platforms, tools, apps, resources, some good, some not so great, some that have gone away, some that got overused. But what I saw was the people that survived and came out the other side were people that took hold of technology, right? Prior to the pandemic, people were not using platforms, LMS systems like Canvas. They weren't fully taking advantage of what Canvas has to offer. You know that, right? And now you can't live without it, right? So it was one of those things, like now we have this learning management system that we run everything through in almost every district in every state in the US, right? Everybody's got some sort of learning management system. And the people that struggled were the people that didn't use technology before that, or that didn't really want to, dip the toe. They'd already been teaching for so many years. So we lost a lot of teachers coming out of the pandemic. We also found out the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And we saw that there was a greater divide than we probably knew of beforehand in terms of uncommon responsibilities, access to resources, right? And there were different ways that we tried to do that. All of this to say, I still think, and it's not a new innovation, it was pre-pandemic, I still think the flipped classroom is one of the best ways to educate students, because direct instruction didn't work when I was in a one-room schoolhouse, many moons ago. And it still doesn't work today, okay? Direct instruction is not going to work for 99% of the kids, right? We need to engage them more. We need them to prepare more. We need to have them collaborate more when they're in the classroom. The only way they can do that is if they're coming to the table with something to offer. And the way that we do that is we create the resources through that flipped classroom, and we try to get out in front of some of those impediments that we talked about, those uncommon responsibilities, whereas the kids have to work, not want to work, like my son, but there's some kids that have to work to contribute to the household. There's some kids that have to take care of other kids. Like, we can't assume that everybody has the time to do the flipped classroom responsibilities. We also have to incentivize it. Yeah, I mean, I use it right now in my college course, and every assignment that I give them that's part of my flipped classroom, I don't get 100% of the students to turn it in. I just don't. And those are college students that are paying to take my course, right? That should be incentive enough. So we have to figure out ways that we would incentivize it. And people ask me that all the time. And I think that comes down to, because I do it in my class and the students will ask me, how am I going to incentivize this? And I said, by building a relationship with that student. That student's going to want to do that activity because they don't want to let you down, not because they intrinsically know that they're going to get something of value from that activity. They're going to do it because they don't want to let you down the next day when you sort of call on them because you built that relationship. And again, that takes time. So I don't say, hey, you got to start the school year on the flipped classroom. You got to sort of like work that stuff in and then sort of gradually get to that point where you're building those flexible activities where the students come prepared to sort of engage and interact with one another. Because, again, direct instruction is not going to do it. We don't have enough time to cover. Remember, we used to have these conversations as social studies teachers every year. If they don't cut something from our curriculum, you're just adding more and more, decades of history. We always used to say, we'd be lucky in teaching U.S. history. We'd be lucky if we made it to World War II, right? So, yeah, I think finding a way to make that flipped classroom, which, like I said, it's only being used in about 25%, a quarter of classrooms are really taking advantage of that across the country. And with the technology, again, back to what came out of the pandemic, here's all this great technology, platforms, apps, sites that you can use. And why aren't we doing it, right? We need to do more of it. Incentivize it, find the right balance to get those kids on.
And that's also a segue and a perfect argument for the case that I would always like to make, that we could do a 4-day work week and we could have kids that are not, if Tom Fisher is passing all of his classes and has A's and B's in all of his classes, why can he not just go ahead and do his work from home 1 day a week? And then all of our kids that got D's and F's, they're the ones that have to come to school, and we're going to go ahead and do remediation and tutoring and all those things. But it's like we embrace that technology, but we haven't completely embraced that as an educational system. When we think about retention, I mean, we're recruiting, we're always trying to get teachers to come be teachers.
Yeah.
Right? But when we think about retention, we're seeing a lot of folks, maybe they come from a different career and they come into the field of education, or they start their college career and then they want to be a teacher and they become a teacher. How do you see getting them to stay in the field of education, to stay as a teacher? How does that look specifically, and how has that changed for you over the last few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the things that, going back to what you said, when you were asking me, like using the video platform and trying to build relationships with admin and getting them to sort of use the platform as well and take advantage of watching those videos of their candidates and giving real feedback. I had a candidate tell me this past year, when I used the guest reviewer process with the candidate and his principal, and he said that when the principal used the guest reviewer, used the video and put the comments on the platform, that was the most beneficial feedback that he'd gotten in the 3 years he'd been at that school from an administrator, was using that technology. And I wasn't surprised, right? I wasn't surprised because I felt like this is a candidate that does his job, you know, he's not like Mr. Holland's Opus or anything like that. People aren't going in there to watch this guy teach or anything, but he does his job. He shows up every day. He follows all the school protocols, and it's a huge school that he's at. And guess what? When it's time for him to get his NESIS data, which that in North Carolina, that's the evaluation system of teachers, he's got all the tick boxes checked, and he's meeting everything, and he's got all of his met standards, and then it gets sent to him, and it's got very little, specific feedback for him. It's individualized and about the teaching that he's doing, and he gets to sign off on it. And he has like a 20-minute conversation with the administrator at the end of the year. And I'm not here hating on admin because that's how it's done. They have a lot of teachers that they have to get out and see. But what happened with that candidate was he's more likely to come back because now he is being given that feedback and he's being told things that he's never been told before. He's being valued, right? And that's, at the end of the day, that's what anybody wants, is to be valued for their work and not be just given some empty plaudits about their work, some empty hyperbole about their work. They want real feedback. They want to be noticed for something that they really did, right? And I think that sometimes using that video platform allows that to happen. And it gives that person that incentive to come back, that they feel valued. I try to make my candidates feel valued. I try to stay connected to candidates, whether they're residents or undergrads. I give them opportunities. When I see opportunity, it doesn't matter what the opportunity is. If I see opportunities and I think somebody fits that opportunity, I will go and ask my former students to come back and be speakers to my class, be on a panel during a Zoom, be part of a webinar. We just did this mentor program where we were putting student teachers of color with mentor teachers of color in schools of students predominantly of color. And at the end of the semester, we had a panel of sort of like experts or people working in the field. And one of them was a former candidate of mine that I worked with in the very first year I was at UNC Charlotte, which when I was an adjunct, which was like 11 years ago. And I've maintained a friendship with this person. And he was part of the panel. You know what I mean? And he has stayed in education, and he was in a rough situation his first couple of years, but he persevered and became, an assistant principal, and then worked in central office in a very specific role. And again, I try to find those people all the time. And one of the things I constantly do is I keep tabs on where they are. And then when they hit that 3-year mark, when they've gotten away from being a BT and they are a fully licensed on their second, contract teacher, their second license, right? Their renewal, when they get that second renewal, I encourage them to be a mentor to the next generation of 49ers coming through. It's 49er way, I call it. Like, give back. I want you to be a clinical educator, a mentor teacher. And I base that on the fact that there's not a lot of opportunity for teachers to move up, right? Like the idea is like, hey, I moved up and I became an assistant principal. Like you became like, you went and did your admin degree. But there was no other opportunity for you, Eric, that you could stay in the classroom, but maybe elevate yourself? Does it have to be department chair, which is more organizational rather than being a mentor to other people? You know what I mean? And I think that's what's missing. I think there's that level of, teacher elevation, betterment, opportunities, teaching that doesn't mean, hey, for me to move up, I have to become an assistant principal or a dean of students and then become a principal. Some people don't want to do that. Guess who didn't want to do that? This guy. This guy started doing like the admin thing, and I was like, I don't want to do this, but I still want to stay with teaching. what do I have to do? And I sort of had to find my own way, find my own place where I fit. You know what I mean? There wasn't necessarily a system in place for teacher elevation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think, if there's, for the superintendents that are listening to this podcast, I think that's happening in more and more parts of the country where there's different teacher leader pathways.
Yeah.
You want to be a multi-classroom leader, an extended impact teacher, those types of things, which is good. But, that is an innovation that needs to be happening more and with more incentive, I think, across the board in education.
And more intentionality. Like, I know that it happens, and you and I have both seen it happen locally, but at the same time, when you're a building leader and you have needs, all of a sudden, the original role that you had put this person in, all of a sudden changes, right? And then they become, it can be disorienting for that person because they thought that they were going to do this and they were sold this bill of goods that they're going to be this multi-classroom teacher leader, and then they end up doing a lot of coverage. Right? They do a lot of coverage because there's a lot of need. I mean, there's a lot of positions that aren't being filled. So again, I understand it from the building leader's perspective, but you've got to find that balance, and you can't do that to somebody that you hired them to do a certain role, and then it becomes more of the same.
So my last question for you is, let's talk a little bit about AI. And I think you're in a unique spot because you're working with college students as students, undergraduate and graduate students, and they're using AI. And then we've got teachers and students who are using AI. So you're seeing kind of both sides of where it is. How do you see it affecting your role? What are you keeping tabs on? What are you worried about? How is it helping you? I've been using it for really unique things in my current role, but I'd love to hear your perspective on where you're seeing AI and its pros and cons in your role.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really all about like embracing it, but also, making sure that they're using it the right way. So instead of like when people first started using it, I was like, don't shut them down from using it. Because one of the big things was candidates struggle with their writing and they wanted to use it on EdTPA. And I was like, immediately I wasn't going to be like, no, don't use it. We'll know if you're using it, don't even dare try to use it. What we did was we embraced it and said, listen, use it, but make sure that you're intentional on how you're using it. So I'll give you an example just from the scores perspective on EdTPA. I don't care where the lesson plans come from. I don't care where the lesson activities come from, and I don't care where the assessments come from. Okay? I don't care. There's stuff everywhere on the internet. They could get it from their methods instructor, their PLC, right? They could get it from Teachers Pay Teachers. They could get AI versions of lesson activities. It doesn't matter. But in EdTPA, you have to justify why you used it with the students that are in front of you. And the artificial intelligence doesn't know who they are. Okay? Only you know who they are. So AI is not going to take away your problem solving skills. Okay? I want them to have the best resources. AI doesn't always provide the best resources. We know that they're not always referencing the best sources, right? The most revered sources, the most accurate sources with AI because of what it's generating. Where it's getting its information is the most used information, not necessarily the best, right? But it generates a lot of good ideas. We use it in one of our workshops for writing, where we ask it a question that's from one of the EdTPA prompts, and it spits out like a top 10 list of strategies. And I'm like, I love it. Would you guys use this strategy? How would you use this strategy? Who are the students in your classroom that you could use this strategy for? The students then have to problem solve and say, okay, this is just the strategy. How does it apply to my students, right? How does it apply to my ELL students? The AI machine doesn't know them. ChatGPT doesn't know the ELL students. They don't know the IEP students, right? They don't know them. Only you, the student teacher, knows them. So at the end of the day, you have to make decisions with the materials you get. And again, the process of doing the teaching, right? Like a lot of work in my class is rehearsal based, right? AI is not going to produce a teacher video for me, and AI is not going to get up in front of their classmates and run through a routine, for my class. So I love that they can find really good strategies quickly instead of spending a lot of time trying to create, because there are no new ideas, right? Like that's the thing. There's no new ideas. They're just taking old ideas and putting a different spin on them or adjusting them to meet the needs of the people in front of you, right? So use AI for that, right? Use AI for that, but don't lose those problem solving skills. And that's what I focus, the use of it on.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how many ways it can be used, but I think bottom line is it's a tool. It can't be, it's not a substitute, it's a tool. And if used well, it can be used in a lot of unique ways. And I think too, it can help during a time right now where people are overworked, to be able to use AI. I mean, you could say, ChatGPT, write me a parent letter to my 6th grade classes in social studies about this coming week or something. And they would, it populates it for it. So, well, Dr. Fisher, I appreciate your time today here on the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. We went just a little bit over, but I do appreciate it. Again, listeners, this is the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast, and it is produced in collaboration with New Era Superintendents. Our guest today is Dr. Tom Fisher. Dr. Fisher, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, what is your email address?
It is TEFISHER@charlotte.edu.
And I want to remind our listeners that, again, Dr. Fisher truly is a national expert when it comes to EdTPA and GoReact. And so those are things that if you ever need any insight, resources, or an overview, Dr. Fisher is, again, a national expert. So we want to thank everybody for listening today, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you. I want to thank our listeners again just for joining us for the latest episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. I really enjoyed having Dr. Fisher on the podcast. I think he shares a lot of great perspective of what it looks like to prepare teachers and how to use technology. He, again, is at the forefront. One of the thoughts that I have is as we embrace this next stage of American education, foundationally, we have to begin to think about how we use some of this technology, not just because we have to, but because it truly can change the game. And teachers, I notice right now, are not getting enough feedback. I think because everybody is so busy, and I talk to so many administrators that they're not really able to give the right feedback. Leaders aren't getting the right feedback. And as a result, if you don't get feedback, how do you grow? And I think that Dr. Fisher has dialed into something that is going to be helpful for us as educational leaders. But the challenge is, how do we really create the margin in our school schedules and our school days to be for leaders and for university professors and for anybody who's a stakeholder in this game to be able to sit down to use the technology and to be able to use it the way it's intended. We have a whole generation of folks right now that don't want to go into teaching. They don't want to be a teacher. And then we have folks that do want to be a teacher, but are woefully unprepared for the challenges that they're going to face. And I think one of the things that we see is that teachers want to teach, but they quickly realize that much of what they're doing is not teaching. It's simply managing a classroom. And so how do we help them do what they want to do? And how do we help school leaders do what they want to do? I do think that there are a lot of folks that are committed to this, but foundationally, we have to shift the way we think about providing feedback and the way we are preparing teachers. I want to thank our listeners again just for the opportunity to serve you through this podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Tom Fisher, our professor at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He did a fantastic job today, and so thank you, Dr. Fisher. Want to remind our listeners this podcast is produced in collaboration with New Era superintendents who are committed to doing whatever it takes to help all students achieve, especially in the areas of reading and math. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode. Thank you.